In this video, I want to describe what I'm looking for the Everyday Monster project. Briefly, I'm looking for you to create an illustration of an everyday monster, a common experience, anthropomorphized as some sort of monster or creature. This is both an exercise in character design and visual metaphor, as you are trying to convey something of the monster's nature through its character design. Let's take a look at some possible subjects that you might want to turn into a monster. The following list is but a sample of possible things to turn into monsters. You get a sense here of what I'm looking for. Something that we all have experienced and recognize as being something that we have to deal with or accommodate in our lives some way. Like little monsters that seem to follow us around, getting in our way and tripping us up just as we think starting to get it all together. Let's take a look at this brief on the idea refinery. On the idea refinery, if I scroll down here, you can see a brief description. I'll let you read this. What I wanted to show you, though, was that there are some links here to some other illustrators who I think are particularly good at character design. One of my favorites is Alberto Ceratino. I'm going to open up Alberto's work. I'll let you explore here, but you can see that Alberto Ceratino is a master at character silhouette, using a minimum of shape and form for the silhouette, but including a lot of graphic texture in the interiors of his shapes. Another illustrator whom I really like is Seb Nyark, a French illustrator. I'm going to open up the post I have on the Idea Refinery, and you get a sense of the character design that this illustrator likes to incorporate. I'll let you click through some of these other links here. There's also this link here to what previous classes have done with this assignment. I'm going to actually jump into Illustrator and we're going to do a quick demo of this guy here. Now this is all Illustrator. If I come to the View drop-down menu and select Outline, you can see that this is a Illustrator file made up of vector paths. Let me just take the elements of this illustration apart just so you can see how this was constructed. We're going to start by creating this eye in just a moment. I have a color overlay here over top of a photographic texture. Let me move that off to the side here. You can see that this texture is actually a fill with inside a vector shape that has an effect on it. We'll create that in just a moment. But around the edge, there is this custom brush that gives us the illusion of that hairy edge. Finally, we have some graphic elements with some drop shadows. We're going to take a look at all these elements and how this was constructed. But we're also going to take a look at a couple of these other Illustrator monsters. And we're going to look at some of the tools that were used to create them as well. So here's what I would like you to do. We're going to come to the File drop-down menu and we're going to select New. And I'm going to use a standard size document, 8.5 by 11. I'm going to keep my orientation as horizontal so it fits in the screen nicely. I'm going to leave my color at CMYK and the resolution high at 300 pixels per inch. I'm going to say create. The first thing we're going to do is create the iris and pupil for our eye. And we're going to do this in such a way as we are only going to need to create one shape. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to come over here to my toolbox and choose my ellipse tool. And in the center of my screen, I'm going to hold down my shift button and drag out a perfect circle like that. I'm going to zoom in just so I can see this a little bit better. I'm going to come over to my color panel and I'm going to change the color settings. First of all, I'm going to bring my stroke indicator forward and I'm going to set that to none. Now I'm going to bring my fill color forward. Because my eye is a monster's eye, I'm going to create a rather strange looking eye color. I'm going to start with orange. Now we are going to make some changes to the gradient of this eye to make it look more like an iris. But before I do that, let's take a quick look at this file that talks about the actual shape of the iris and pupil of the eye. The colored part of the eye is called the iris, and as you can see from this diagram here, it is slightly conical, meaning it slants into the center of the eye with the opening being the pupil, like that. When light from above hits our eye, it'll hit the bottom part of our iris, leaving the top part of our iris in shadow. Well, that's exactly what we're going to do with our gradient. We're going to come over to our gradient panel, and I'm going to begin my gradient creation process by dragging this orange color into my gradient slider. I'm going to duplicate that gradient slider by holding down my option button. And now I'm going to get rid of the original black and white sliders. I'm going to drag those out like that. And this second slider on the right, I'm going to double click it. And I want to make this darker. I'm going to add a little bit of cyan and a little bit of magenta. Again, I'm not adding black, If you've seen some of my other videos where I work with gradients, I try not to add black if I can avoid it, just because it is such a deadening color. It will reduce the vibrancy of your color. There I go. And now I'm going to change the angle of my gradient so that the light part of the gradient is at the bottom and the dark part is at the top. Okay. Now let's take a look at this eye again. You'll notice that the color of the iris gets very dark just as it starts to connect to the whites of the eye. Let's do that darkening of color now. There's a couple of different ways we could do this, but I'm going to do this by adding an effect. Again, I'm going to come to the appearance panel. We're going to be assembling most of this eye here in the appearance panel. I'm going to select my fill layer, and I'm going to add an effect to it by coming to the bottom of my appearance panel and clicking on the effects button. Here from this menu, I'm going to come here to stylize. I'm going to add one of my all-time favorite effects. I call it my desert island effect. If I could only have one effect, this would be it, the inner glow. I know it doesn't sound like much, but it is one of my secret weapons. Now, the way inner glow normally works is the blend mode is set to screen and the color swatch is set to white. But I like to set this up a little bit differently so it gives me a slightly different look. I'm going to change the blend mode from screen to multiply. And I'm going to change the color swatch to a darker version of the orange that I have here in my eye color. Now underneath here you can see that I have a couple of values. The opacity, of course, refers to how opaque this new multiply color is, but blur refers to how far into the shape does that blur extend. And you can see as I increase that value, I get that increasing into the shape. For my iris color, I don't want this to extend too far. Now, of course, you might have different values for your effect here, depending on the size of your circle. All I'll say is that you want to have your inner glow effect coming in just enough so that you can see it, but not too deep into your shape. There is the colored iris. Let's create the pupil. And we're going to do that right here in this circle shape that we have selected right now. First of all, I'm going to come over here to the appearance panel. I'm going to select the fill color that I currently have selected. And I'm going to come down here to the bottom of the appearance panel and click duplicate selected item. That's going to give me two fill colors sitting right over top of each other, both set to the same value. But this top fill here, I'm going to change it. First of all, with that selected, I'm going to come over to my gradient panel and I'm going to change the nature of my gradient to a radial gradient. Now this gradient is going to be my pupil, but the pupil color is, of course, black. I'm going to take this left color slider on the left edge, double click it, and make that black by clicking on this color swatch right here. I'm going to do the same with this second color stop on the right hand side, double click it and make that black as well. However, I'm going to change the opacity of this second color stop on the right from 100% down to 0%. And you can see what's happened here. I now have a black opaque center radiating out to a transparent black on the outside, but it doesn't look like a pupil yet. In order to do that, I'm going to take this first slider on the left and drag it towards the center of my gradient slider. And you can see how that now increases the amount of my gradient that is solid black. This second slider, though, I'm going to click on it and drag it towards the center as well until it is right next to the first color stop. And you can see I've now created a pupil. Now the size of a pupil is really important in determining what your character looks like. The larger the pupil in relation to the iris, the more that character is going to look appealing. However, if we make that pupil really small, this character is going to have a completely different look. I'll let you decide what the pupil size is. I'm going to make mine just sort of like that. Okay. Let's take a look at our eye sample again. If I take a look here, you can see that the iris isn't just a solid color. In fact, it's got multiple colors going on, and there's all these striations inside of that. Let's create that effect. And I'm going to come to the appearance panel. I'm going to come over here to my stroke property. I'm going to give this eye a bright yellow stroke. There you go. I have a stroke that goes around the edge of that eye. Now we're going to add a couple of effects just to the stroke property in order to get it to look like the striations in the iris of the eye. Let me show you how we're going to do that. First of all, make sure that you have the stroke property selected here in your appearance panel. You can tell it's selected because it's highlighted blue. And I'm going to add an effect by coming to the effects drop-down menu. And I'm going to come here to where it says path. I'm going to click here where it says offset path. Now you can see what our default setting of a positive value will do. It takes that yellow stroke that I just had around the outside edge of the circle and offsets it by this amount on the outside of our shape. But if I were to make this a negative value by clicking inside of that field and putting a minus sign in front of that value and then saying preview, you can see that now that line is on the inside of this shape. And that's exactly what we want. What I really want is for this line to be exactly halfway between the outside edge of my iris and the outside edge of my pupil. So roughly about here. It needs to come in just a little bit more than it currently is, just so that becomes 2. There I go. That looks like it's halfway in between the outside of the iris and the outer edge of the pupil. I'm going to say OK. Now with this stroke still selected, again, I'm going to come here to the Effects drop-down menu, and I'm going to select Distort and Transform Zigzag. And you can see already that zigzag is applying a starburst effect to that outline. First of all, I'm going to increase the number of ridges, something like that. Now this size allows me to change the length of those striations, but be careful, you don't want to extend it beyond the outer edge of your iris. I'm going to leave mine roughly like that. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the nature of the points from corner to smooth. We are almost done. Again, with this stroke panel still selected, I'm going to add yet one more effect. I'm going to again come to the Effects drop-down menu. I'm going to come here to Distort and Transform. And this time I'm going to click Roughen. And I'm going to set my roughen values. And I'm going to let you decide what values you want to use. That's looking pretty good. I'm going to add yet one more effect here. With this stroke still selected, I'm going to come to the Effects drop-down menu. Now I'm going to come down here to where it says Photoshop Effects. Now, the difference between Illustrator effects and Photoshop effects is just that Illustrator will have to convert your vector path into a rasterized image before it can apply the Photoshop effects. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here to where it says Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I'm going to choose a value here, roughly around 2 pixels. That's going to soften those striations. Now, before we do anything else, let's rearrange our shapes here. My striations right now are on top of my pupil, but I'm going to change that by dragging my pupil above the striations. That might fix any problems if you have your striations that are extending into your pupil shape. The last thing I want to do here is I want to put a highlight into my eye, and I'm going to do that by, first of all, selecting the layer that makes up my pupil. I'm going to come to the bottom of my appearance panel and click on this icon, Duplicate Selected Item. I now have 2 black pupils sitting over top of each other. But this top pupil here, I'm going to select it and open up the gradient panel. Now this gradient is currently made up of 2 black color stops. I'm going to double click both of them and make them white. The last step is I'm going to move and resize this gradient by coming over to my toolbox and clicking on my gradient tool. And with this gradient still selected in my appearance panel, I can click and redraw that highlight someplace else. There I go. If I zoom out, I can see I now have an eye that I can use in my illustration. If I come back to here, you can see that that is essentially what's going on with this eye, where I have a number of strokes and fills to create this iris. The eyeball itself, if I click on that here, you'll see is just a circle with a gradient applied to it. But I have inset that eyeball into 2 other circular shapes to suggest this mechanical nature of the eye. And I've also included a reflected light into the shadow of this eyeball as the light off the bottom surface here reflects back into the shadow here. Okay, in our next video, we are going to recreate the fur using a photograph and a custom brush.